what would happen, and this was the genesis of the idea, what would happen if I was a hitman and in the company that I was doing my co-op with, somebody in that office died? Who would they suspect? Would they suspect the co-op student? No, never. Right? And that's where I got the idea for a CIA-sponsored espionage, counter-espionage ring run on the university level using students, co-op students, as the operatives.
Hello, welcome to Square Peg's podcast.
In this podcast, we share first-hand experiences of neurodiverse graduate students and faculty members.
I'm your sometimes guest host, Lexi Hain.
And I'm the host, Arash Zaghi. Today, I'm honored to host Dr. Dennis Grubb, a distinguished expert in environmental engineering with over 30 years of experience. He stands out not only for his impressive portfolio of over 65 reference journal publications and 4 patents, but also for his journey as a successful neurodiverse individual with ADHD and dyslexia. Dennis's neurodiversity has fueled his creativity and innovative problem solving. It has enabled him to make significant contributions to the restoration of highly polluted environments to safe conditions. I really enjoyed my conversation with Dennis and got inspiration from it. I hope you enjoyed as well. Give it a listen. Hi, Dennis. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview with me. When my department head sent me your information, I was like, oh, this is the type of guy I want to talk to, actually. So I'm going to do something crazy here. Tell us something exciting about a gold mine. Let's start the conversation like that.
Something about a gold mine. For your viewers, just to sort of dive into this then, I'm 59 years old. I'm a technology fellow at Jacobs. I've been in and out of academia. In a prior life, I was a professor at Georgia Tech, and during that time, I had some research contracts in Peru. And when I was in Peru, I was working for a mine in the middle of the second Altiplano, and we actually got to hold gold bars, doré bars, that they produced on site because they had a cyanide leaching process. And they had a mini smelter there, and they produced the gold bars, which was probably, 92% gold, and the balance was silver. And then they took us, on one occasion, I have a picture of my former student, Bill Deasing, holding one of these, which they are surprisingly heavy. Mm-hmm. And then we flew out on a twin prop from this place. And basically, they landed in this canyon area, and we went out with a series of armed guards with M16s, and about 4 crates of gold was the weekly pickup. And we flew back from this mine to Jorge Chavez in Lima, Peru, and they let us off the plane and then whisked the gold over to Swissair, and probably 8 hours later, it was in Zurich. But it was pretty fascinating watching the cyanide leaching process and seeing the finished gold bars sort of right there in your face going, yeah, in 1997 dollars, this was over $100,000, right? This little ingot. It was pretty interesting.
That's interesting. And so that was good because you gave us an understanding of the type of projects that you've been involved in. So I want to take a turn and ask you why you consider yourself a square peg.
Well, when I was growing up, there was no ADHD. But I have every probably markable sign of being ADHD. Back in my day, which was sort of, I was born in 1965, when I was a young child, they just called it, you have ants in your pants. And so I was very active, did a lot of sports. And so there were a lot of things that didn't capture my attention. One of them was actually reading. And so I developed significant reading comprehension problems, which followed me all the way through my development into and starting Drexel, and which is where I did my undergrad in civil engineering. And I basically cratered the first 2 years because I was functionally illiterate when I graduated from high school. So just for perspective, right, when you graduate from high school, you take the SATs to get into college. I got a 390 on my verbal. I think they give you 300, right, to write your name down. So I purely got into Drexel. I don't know how I got on the strength of maths. And I wanted to be an architect, which speaks to sort of that creativity, that has sort of gone through my life. They didn't have architecture at Drexel, so I thought, well, I'll go into the next best thing, which was civil engineering, and become a structural engineer. And then I hated structures and structural engineering, and finally found my home in interdisciplinary work in environmental engineering and hazardous waste cleanups, which is what I do. It's very fulfilling.
How was your pre-college school experience? Does anything stand out
On which
to you?
continent?
Okay, tell us about those.
I grew up in suburban Philadelphia mostly until I was 8 years old. Then my dad worked for Univac back in the day, and he picked up the family and took us on an adventure to Johannesburg, South Africa. This was in 1973 in the middle of apartheid, and we were there for 2 years. And I transitioned from, a public American school to a private Catholic school in downtown Johannesburg called St. David's, where I regularly got the cane, as did all of my classmates, because it was just that's how you treated boys and got them to pay attention. You threatened them with the cane. And then after 2 years of that, we were transferred. We almost went to Tehran right before Khomeini came into power, but my mother didn't like Tehran, and we ended up going to London, which was actually interesting because about 6 months later, our school tripled in size because of everybody leaving Iran back in the day. So I became part of the American Community School, first in Wimbledon, then in Cobham. So those were sort of my formative years. And then when I was 14, we moved back to suburban Philadelphia, and I went into, high school in the U.S.
Can you give us an idea about how different it was being at school in US and South Africa and then UK? Systematically, were there differences for a non-traditional learner like you?
There's not much I remember about so I grew up in Hilltown, Pennsylvania, went to this place called Margaret Seiler. There's not a whole lot I remember about that. My sort of memories really start upon arriving in Johannesburg because it was a very jarring experience culturally, right? Suburban Philadelphia, green. Johannesburg, you're above, right? You're over a mile high there. It's 6,000 feet. So now you're in the desert. It's, the middle of apartheid. All the white families have tennis courts or pools. You're part of an international society and club, basically. And so very privileged. And then I went to a private Catholic school. There was only one Black person there. He was an American, and that had certain strings attached to it, obviously. But other than that, it was, all the international kids were there, including the Jewish ones, because the Catholic schools were amongst the best. And so that's where I learned that there were other languages. I mean, I didn't even know there were other parts of the world when I was 8 years old. And I remember I had to take Afrikaans, and I'm like, I don't know what this is. And so I got a D. I still have my report card. My mother gave it to me a couple of years ago when they finally left the house in Telford, Pennsylvania. And, it says on my transcript, D, a valiant effort. So it was very... It was very different, just the regimen of being in a private Catholic school and the discipline that went with that, i.e. the caning, was vastly different. I did join the chess club there and got very much into that. And in fact, I had to quit because I was dreaming in chess, and I actually became the number 2 seat in my grade, and I wasn't getting any sleep. I was dreaming in chess. All I would do was think about chess, because part of what I'm good at is sort of solving puzzles. And I think chess is a puzzle, and it really helps individuals plan and look ahead, right? You have to play 10 moves ahead. Yeah. And so I was able to do that very well. And that's, probably has to do something with my personality and my makeup, and has been an asset at the end of the day. But I had to give up the chess because I wasn't getting any sleep. And then I was very athletic. I was swimming, playing tennis, playing soccer. That's where I learned how to play soccer. And soccer, again, is another one of these things where I wasn't interested in the exercise per se. I was interested in the game and the strategy of scoring, right? I don't lift. I don't know how people lift weights. It's so monotonous and boring. But, soccer, my mind is engaged with the strategy of the game. And so I'm getting, I'm running, what do you run in a game? 5 miles or something like that? The
Hmm.
exercise is a byproduct of the game. Otherwise, I wouldn't be
Interesting.
able to do it. So I can't watch baseball.
So you approach it intellectually, not
Yeah.
physically.
So
Okay.
in the UK, so again, very different, private, non-parochial school. I will tell you that I really enjoyed England. I really loved England, the history, the culture. The American Community School there was, they were a bit overwhelmed because, as I said, when everything started happening in the Middle East, the school doubled and tripled in size. That was not just the American Community School in Cobham. I think it happened in Wimbledon and the American School of London. So there was just a huge influx of people coming back from that part of the world, back to the European headquarters. And, I think about what was happening there. And that's where I sort of really became aware of when we arrived in Wimbledon, which is where I went to school first. I really became aware of I sort of was not able to read. To me, reading was, and what I understood was, and they had these reading books that you had to go through and progress through
Yeah.
this. And I was way behind because to me, I thought reading was looking at the words. And I would look at the words, but it didn't go in. I wasn't comprehending this. The only
Hmm.
thing that I learned from was sort of watching TV, listening. I was very good at math and very good at visual stuff, but I could not really do anything reading comprehension wise unless it was something like a World War II novel
Hmm.
or a spy novel. And again, it's about solving the puzzle. And I was all in, and I basically could quote the novel to you almost verbatim because my attention was so focused on that. So it was a real problem with the focus, particularly in reading, writing, grammar. I didn't know how to diagnose a sentence. And I think a lot of this sort of had to do with changing education systems, right? American, South
Hmm.
African, English, right? And they're doing different things at different times. And I think
Yeah.
a person like me with, my proclivity to sort of have reading issues anyway and attention issues anyway, I think I got lost in all of that. And I faked it basically probably all the way through to the end of high school.
How did you do that? How did you fake it?
Well, I did other stuff, right? I was all league in soccer. I
Hmm.
played soccer all the time. I was very good at math. When I went back so in England, they basically graduated you bi or trilingual. And so, I took French the first year and then I transitioned into Spanish, and that went really well. By the time I went back to the States in 1979, I was fully articulate in conversational Spanish. And so when I came back to the States in ninth grade, across the board, not just Spanish, my ninth grade in the US was a complete repeat of my
Mm.
eighth grade in the private American system in London. And so that was a giant turnoff. And the other thing that happened there, psychologically speaking, was, this was the third time I was moving in 6 years. And so I'm like, why the hell would I bother getting to know anybody in middle school here? Because I'm going to high school,
Mm.
next year. There's more students there, and then I'm going to college. Why should I bother getting to know anybody and becoming intimate or anything like that? Because I'm just going to have to say goodbye to these people again. So
Mm.
I really sort of became very angry, among other things, and just bored. My parents should have sent me, they talked about sending me to this place called the Hill School, but, I think that the U.S. school officials here in sort of the ninth and 10th grade, they're like, well, he didn't do so well, in England, so we can't put him in the AP courses. Little did
Mhm.
we know that I already knew the AP stuff. And so I didn't do a whole lot in high school. I just sort of did what I wanted. And
Mhm.
that actually cost me dearly when it came time to go to college because, as I said, I had fallen behind in just about everything because I was mentally checked out.
Dennis, I mean, like you have a wealth of experience. Now, if you look back, what would be your piece of advice to a parent that is raising a non-traditional learner, highly creative, maybe struggling in certain topics, maybe dyslexic like
Well,
myself and
this
like
is actually
you?
very close to home because my son has ADD,
Okay.
which is different than what I have, and he's an only child. So that has some unique challenges associated with it as well. What I would tell my younger self, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
could do that, right?
Okay.
Stick it out. There are just things you're going to have to take care of. And regardless of whether you're bored or not, the school doesn't get you, right? Just watch the movie The Accountant. And, here's a super, super bright guy that doesn't fit any of the molds. And, the way you learn is not being tested. But this is the way society has decided to go in terms of education. And there isn't a good substitute for it. So you're going to have to figure out how to survive and how to find things in the school setting which you can excel at. So you can at least say, hey, these were the things that were important to me, and these are the things that I excelled at. And when I'm interested and when I'm captivated, I do really, really well in these areas. And I also spent a lot of time in counseling because obviously with all that moving, I was a very angry young man. And this is when the punk revolution was happening. So you can imagine that, right? Sex Pistols and the Anarchy and, all that. There was a lot of angry young men,
Yeah.
in the late 70s. And so what you need to find an outlet for your interests, whether it's sports. My brother, for instance, who also had some issues, to him, it was American football. Right. And he played football and, that's what he loved to do. And that's what got him through the day. And so I think you're going to have to find a way to sort of survive the system. I also didn't do very well in standardized exams.
Okay.
That was a real problem. And that was a problem that followed me through my PhD.
Yeah,
But,
I know.
My PhD advisor just sat me down and goes, look, I can't do this for you. We all know that you're bright. We all know that you're gifted. We all know that you're smart. But we can't do this for you. You're just going to have to get through this. And, there's some things that you just have to get through. And, it sucks.
That's very
That's the way
interesting
it
to
is.
say that, because our approach toward neurodiversity, different dimensions of that ADHD, dyslexia, autism, has been from the very beginning that we started doing this work was to shift the focus from deficits to strengths, because the education is so focused on deficits and mitigation and like forcing kids to be better at things that they just don't want to be good at ever, and they, even if they can kind of mitigate some of those problems, I mean, the kid is not going to be ever like pursuing that field that like the education system is like emphasizing so much on. So that's interesting that you said that, like, bring your interests, your skills to play. One specific question I have is about your creativity. Did you ever use your creativity to cope, to come up with creative strategies to make up for things that you had challenges with?
I should probably also sort of indicate somewhere here that emotional intelligence is also sort of a really important part of who people are. And I don't know if it's just me or this is a issue with people with ADHD, ADD, and, others that may be on the spectrum. But my wife would tell you that I have a negative, emotional intelligence score. And so
tell us about that.
We'll get
what
to
does that mean?
But I tend to be like, well, the answer is this, and because, of it's not really the gift of foresight, but being able to see the end at the beginning, right? Which I think is important for creative people. You have a white canvas, some people just see what they're going to paint. It's just sort of followed by numbers in their head, right? I sort of have this attribute in a couple different areas, like, integrated engineering problems. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work. And I can see the end. And so I was really disruptive when I was at Drexel and Stanford and Berkeley, frankly, all of those places, because I was very quick to see what the solution was. And I was able to peel away all the crap that didn't matter and get to a viable answer very, very quickly. And this has actually been a challenge with my professional career because, part of what you need to do with the emotional intelligence, and I've had coaching on that, is you got to find a way to bring people along. So for those that are in high school, I guess what I would recommend is If you feel like you are eccentric, unusual, you have skills that aren't being
Celebrated.
validated or reinforced or appear to even be of value, I would tell you work with your parents and get into some counseling where you can understand more about yourself and what your attributes are and specifically what your strengths are so that you can find a way to emphasize those because the rest of what you're doing in high school is probably going to be a slog. It's just going to be unbearable. And it was for me. And that was like in the late 70s. With everything sort of becoming the lowest common denominator, right, in education, in my opinion, as opposed to, creating Renaissance people,
Yeah.
which is very unusual. And those people are all eccentric. You just go look
Yes.
at them all, right?
Da Vinci's, yeah.
We're not, and Ken Robinson, Sir Ken Robinson, the educator, talks a lot about, killing creativity. And you have to find a way to keep it alive in yourself, because when you get out of high school, you're going to find another venue where it's going to be valued. College does not create entrepreneurs. What it does, and engineering education, in my opinion, is vocational training. I'm becoming a specialist. I'm not becoming a Renaissance man. I'm not getting a broad education. I'm getting engineering education so that I can solve technical problems. There are some humanities and stuff like that on the side, but there's a whole bunch of creative things that aren't even being accessed. And ultimately, creativity is how I got into graduate school, but we'll get to that in a minute. But you need to be able to breathe and you need to be able to be happy. So whatever you're good at and you enjoy from a creative perspective, chase that. I painted, I wrote poetry, even though I was sort of functionally illiterate. I still had feelings and had to sort of puke them out on paper, right? Because you're a teenager, right? You got all kinds of stuff going through your head. And so I had already written poetry and stuff like that. And you just have to find a way or you're going to go crazy. So, and document it. And that became really important because I wasn't even going to graduate school at Drexel. Again, I cratered my first 2 years because I was functionally illiterate, and I realized I'm not going to be able to read this physics book. So I went into remedial English. I had a very good family friend who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania that really helped me through the fundamentals of reading and writing. Everything I turned in was like a 10th draft, but I knew if I didn't make that investment my first year at Drexel, I was done. But I documented all the creativity, and that became really important when it was time to pivot and go to graduate school because I won what was called an NSF Creativity Award in undergraduate engineering. So my first 2 years, I had like a 2.1, 2.2 at Drexel and almost got weeded out. In fact, I got into an architecture school at Temple, but I had exhausted so much energy in civil engineering. I'm like, why would I quit now? And that's when I started getting to the technical courses that were super interesting. So part of this is just stamina and resilience. You have to get through it, right? Just try and get through it. Eventually, somebody is going to spot you and your creativity and your uniqueness, and they are going to help you. And I had 3 people in my professional life that were seminal in that regard. One was a guy named Joe Martin, professor of civil engineering at Drexel University. He was kind of like a deadhead. He was like 6'5". He was also from a big Irish Catholic family. He was really important because he saw my creativity. The next person was Nick Sitar, professor of civil engineering at University of California, Berkeley. He was my PhD mentor. And another guy named Ed Kavazanjian, who was with Geosyntec at the time, a consulting company that paid for me to finish at Berkeley. And now he's at ASU. He was a really sort of important bridge between academia and getting back into industry. And he excelled at both. Without those 3 individuals, I wouldn't be who I am today. Just, not a chance. So I'm very thankful to them. And I'm really thankful for the NSF Creativity Award program because I got into graduate school at Stanford with a 2.8. But the criteria for that, right? The criteria for that award was demonstrate your creativity, know GPA, and the professors and those writing your recommendations weren't allowed to talk about your GPA, and no GRE scores. So NSF, I think at that point, this was back in the late 80s, they must have recognized that in engineering, there wasn't creativity. And of course, this was in the middle of the height of the Cold War, right, with Russia. The wall came down in 1989, so this is 1988. They must have felt that, we're creating maybe a monoculture, and we need people who can think outside of the box. So let's throw all these awards out there and get creative people into our graduate programs and infuse this. And I was one of those people. I won the competition on the basis of my proposal, which was about contamination at rural farms. You have all these massive farms that are out there, but everything is concentrated in and around the house and the barn. So you have all the oil storage tanks, you have the septic field, you have the drinking water well right there, pigsties, manure, all kinds of things. And the well is like right in the middle of all of this. Who knows how farmers are contaminating themselves and poisoning themselves based on, right, what's going on in the core structural area, the core operational area of a farm. And I was into what we call non-aqueous phase liquids. And so that was my proposal. And they were like, how did you think of this? And I'm like, to the NSF panel, I'm like, haven't you guys ever been to a farm? I just look at my neighbor across the street, and everything is sort of consolidated within like a quarter to a half acre. How can there not be oil in his well from his oil storage tank, right? The other part of that was to sort of demonstrate creativity. And at that time, I was at Drexel from 1983 to 1988. It's a 5-year program. What they do there is it is a graduation requirement that you have 18 months of job experience in your major. And so you do what you call engineering co-ops. So your first year is 3 quarters. Your middle 3 years are 2 quarters, right, in school, 2 quarters working in industry somewhere. My roommate, for instance, ended up on the Greenland ice cap on a early warning, radar station, jacking that up in the ice sheet. I did a couple different engineering co-op projects in what ended up being the field called geoenvironmental engineering. So combination of geotechnical, geological, and environmental contamination. And that's where I practice today. And then your last year, right, is, 3 quarters in school, and then you graduate. So in 1985, I ended up doing a co-op with a company called Goldberg Zoino. I went from Philadelphia to Rhode Island. Again, as I said earlier, right, I grew up with James Bond. I grew up with World War II movies and stuff like that, and I love that stuff, That's sort of what I dreamed about was, being in an espionage thriller. And so I went up there on my own. I moved to Providence, Rhode Island, and I remember sitting on the sofa one night drinking some Budweiser, and I was miserable. I was so miserable. And I remember sitting there, I'm like, nobody knows I'm here. And I was wallowing in self-pity. And then I was like, wait a minute, the genius of that. I'm a co-op student in a foreign city. I could be a hitman and nobody would have any idea who I was or that I did it. So Drexel has all these co-op positions in the Department of Navy. I did one for NAVFAC at the Philadelphia Naval Base. My roommate was up on the Greenland ice cap in this, military installation for 6 months. Didn't do anything but work and sleep. And then through, Roman Haas, DuPont, all these big petrochemical companies, what would happen, and this was the genesis of the idea, what would happen if I was a hitman and in the company that I was doing my co-op with, somebody in that office died? Who would they suspect? Would they suspect the co-op student? No, never. Right? And that's where I got the idea for a CIA-sponsored espionage, counter-espionage ring run on the university level using students, co-op students, as the operatives. This was the United States answer to the open training of the Soviet military, right, to become spies. Remember their hockey teams were all military guys and stuff like that in the 70s and 80s? Well, how are we going to do it, right, with plausible deniability? So this co-op program is where they train the spies and the assassins. So here I am being interviewed by the National Science Foundation. It was like this Last Supper. So I was in the Hilton in South Philly. It's now a casino, long table, very intimidating. You walk in, at the end is, the guy who's going to make all the decisions. And there's all these profs sitting there. And they're like, well, tell us about your proposal and how you got your idea. And I said the whole bit about, well, my neighbor's a fireman. This seems to be a problem that nobody's really thinking about. And so they saw that as being unique and creative, that I was spotting a problem that nobody had thought about. And then they said, well, I see here you're, 6 chapters or so into this novel. Can you tell us about this novel? And so I basically said what I just said to you today, a couple minutes ago. And the guy at the end goes, I'm sorry, where did you say you wanted to go to graduate school? I said, well, I want to go to the University of California, Berkeley. It has the best geotechnical engineering program in the world.
Yeah.
And that's where I'd like to go. And he goes, but you're doing environmental stuff. Have you talked to Perry McCarty at Stanford University? And I'm like, no, but I'll call him as soon as I get out of this meeting. Sure enough, I walked out of the meeting and I called Stanford and I said, can I talk to Perry McCarty? And I said, I was just in this thing where an interview for a creativity award in undergraduate engineering, and they told me I should be applying to Stanford. So can you please send me an application? And a couple days later, I wasn't even going to Drexel. I was like in 4th in line to stay at Drexel to be in the geotech program there. And, 2 weeks later, I won 3 years of $30,000 apiece, or $90,000 total to go to graduate school of my choosing, in essence.
Nice.
And so I went and did my master's at Stanford in environmental engineering. And then with a balance of the 2 years on that, I went to Berkeley, which I consider to this day to be my intellectual home. So, because that's where the weird people are, and I'm a weird person. And I felt like a second-class citizen at Stanford the whole time.
Dennis, I have this question, and this is something that I have been wondering about, and that is fascinating that we're talking about this now. It seems we had figured it out at some point how to do it right, this NSF creativity program or some of the unique educational programs that they were able to train unique talents in science and engineering, but we somehow moved away from it and we went back, or we went more toward like standardized testing, GPA thing. What do you think happened? Have you ever thought about that?
I don't know that I can answer that. What I can tell you was that I felt inadequate at Stanford because I was surrounded by the creme de la creme from the world. Right here, I'm a big fish at Drexel. Right, I'm a big fish in a small pool. Right, in a small fish tank. I get out to Stanford, and it was the same at Berkeley. Frankly, these are the best and brightest from around the world, and I'm some Philly kid with a 2.8. Right, going into this place with a creativity award, and I'm surrounded by people that have 4.0s and 4.3s. How am I going to compete with this? Creativity, being able to think outside of the box. And I sort of realized that there. I ended up in counseling at Stanford because I was having basically a nervous breakdown because I didn't feel like I belonged. Everybody sort of looked down their nose at me, I felt like. And this was a guy from Brown. He was genius. He said exactly sort of what I needed to hear. And it was sitting right in front of my face and I couldn't see it. And this is why I'm telling the younger generation, just fight your way through it. You'll get there. I swear to God, you'll get there. He said to me, all those other people, right? They took the easy way to get into Stanford. They got the 4.0s. Like getting a 4.0 is easy, right? My last couple of years at Drexel, I think I averaged like a 3.5. So 2.1, the first, year, 2.2 the next year. And then it all came together and I had like an average of 3.5 for the last 3 years. But that's not enough to get into a place like Stanford. And, I didn't have to take the GREs. So, I didn't get disqualified on that. And I didn't get disqualified on the basis of the GPA. I got in because I was creative. And this guy said, look, it's like Robert Frost, the road less traveled. You went all the way through the mountains. You did all this creative stuff and you came down and you got to the other side of the mountain pass and you rejoined the highway and you got to exactly where they were by taking the superhighway. You deserve to be here, if not even more than them, because you did it the hard way. You did it a way that was unexpected. And then I got it. It was, right?
I hope to see more of that, honestly, today. But
so let's go back to the NSF creativity for a second.
Yeah.
What should they be doing? I can't advise NSF, on what they should be doing. What I think would be really interesting is to find out retrospectively, where are all those people who won NSF Creativity Awards during the years that those NSF Creativity Awards were awarded? Because I'm one of them. And now I'm a technology fellow at Jacobs, one of the biggest A&E companies in the world. And I deal with the worst of the worst Superfund sites that, right, nobody can solve and nobody can come up with a cleanup solution for. Why? Because I'm creative and I integrate civil, geotechnical, environmental, and I have a minor in chemical engineering. I'm very, very diverse. And so, they need a guy like me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Jacobs is big enough that they have a whole career path for subject matter experts. And so I'm basically an internal consultant. So I work for Fortune 100 companies pretty much around the world. And my expertise areas are environmental cleanup, mine waste cleanup, and I'm also probably a leading expert in beneficial use of industrial byproducts and recycled materials. And I have a number of paper awards in that area, which again is sort of, when I tell people I was functionally illiterate going into Drexel, they go, huh? What? You've got like 65 journal publications and all these awards and patents to your name. How's that possible? It's creativity and sticking with the creativity. And so to the younger generation, stick with it. Work hard. You will get there. Somebody's going to see the light. Doesn't matter if you're in dance, theater, engineering, history, I don't know. Wherever you are, somebody is going to see the spark and you work for that. That's what you're working for. And so don't give up. But I would be interested to understand where all these people ended up. Yeah. I had a classmate, Dan Zittimer, who also won at Drexel. And, he was essentially like a concert pianist. And he was hysterical. And I think he's a professor at Marquette. So I don't know anybody else who sort of won this thing. I think it would be interesting to find out, hey, we fueled creativity. Where did that creativity land?
Yeah.
And I don't think that necessarily graduate school and the entrance requirements for a graduate school are really set up to handle eccentric people necessarily.
They're not.
What they're looking for is people who are really good at engineering, really good communicators. And sometimes, and I think Berkeley is a place that is looking beyond that for sure, because I felt at home at Berkeley. There were so many weird people walking around Berkeley because it's Berkeley that I'm like, I fit in here. I'm not even going to get noticed. And
do you think they kept the same culture or they changed?
I go back to Berkeley from time to time. I was just there for the geotechnical seminar this spring, and it was good to be there. And, Berkeley is always changing, but what doesn't change about Berkeley is it's just fundamentally eccentric and creative. And so, and it's an urban environment, right? So I felt completely at home there. And again, that's why I sort of look at Berkeley as my spiritual home. And so getting back to the NSF, one of the things that started happening when I was at Berkeley is they really started a push with women and minorities in engineering. And to me, this is super, super important. And the reason I say that is, okay, so, I may be this crazy ADHD guy with not, a lot of emotional intelligence, and I bring a specific perspective to the world. But every culture, every religion, every gender, every different person brings something else. Yeah. And so I wonder, did they sort of decide to go in that area and really begin funding, women and minorities in engineering to increase the diversity of engineering and the breadth and the perspectives by adopting a strategy like that. And I have no idea, but I had the privilege at Berkeley and Georgia Tech when I was a professor there of just some remarkably brilliant young women and minorities coming into the university and just being like completely wowed.
So I want to take this opportunity. We are seeing a lot of initiatives to encourage the participation of minoritized groups, and they are working. I think they're facilitating the participation of those people that they are marginalized. They're traditionally underrepresented. What is missing in that narrative is the lack of focus on the unique skills and talents that you exactly mentioned. I mean, like, it's just numbers that, we need this many students from this culture or kind of like this ethnicity. I hope at some point we start thinking about the importance of diverse skills that they bring to the table, because there will be no political argument around that we need diversity of talents. It's not about the color of skin, it's not about gender, it's just about the diversity of talents. And if there is a one-size-fits-all model when it comes to complex problems, we are going to make huge mistakes in our engineering design. I mean, like, we're going to be blindsided because everyone is going to think the same way, see the problem the same way, communicate it the same way. So I hope we start thinking about diversity a little deeper than we're doing today. So rather than focusing only on numbers, we start thinking about the importance of diverse ways of looking at, because what we are doing essentially, like I stayed in academia, you left academia, we are saying, okay, all of these diverse populations are welcome, but we collect them, we attract them, but at the same time, they have to all go through the same model. So what is that? What's the point of diversity here? If you're not celebrating these different ways of learning, communicating, processing, seeing the world, then what's the point of that? I mean, like, if you're just thinking about their presence in the room, that is not diversity. I mean, like, true inclusion only comes through meaningful participation. So that's, I think, is missing. I mean, like, we definitely have a more diverse body of students in engineering, but like, in terms of like celebrating the diversity of minds and life experiences, I don't think we are there yet.
I don't know how you fix that. While I did well my last 3 years and I was able to get through, I mean, I had struggles there. And so if I was to suggest, for instance, that they should find a way to update or upgrade, right, the creativity awards in engineering, who's to say those people are going to survive in the academic environment? And if the academic environment's even right for them.
That's the thing.
If what we're looking for is creativity and entrepreneurialism, then I guess maybe there needs to be something else, for diverse creative people with different talents and perspectives and attributes. It's a good thought experiment. It would be interesting to see what happens there. I'm an experimentalist, basically, at heart. I run a lot of the treatability study work at Jacobs to be able to solve these complex environmental problems. So I'm always tinkering. I'm not a numerical modeling guy. I can't stand that. I don't have the patience for it. So what are they going to do about an incubator? I mean, how do you do an incubator when you're an NSF or something like that? I think that's a real challenge. I don't know how you would do that.
Can you speak to the work that you do, which is highly multidisciplinary, complex, ill-formulated problems? Every problem is different. There is no kind of like template that you can use for this project and like apply to the next one. You tell us. I mean, again, like, I'm in academia, but like, you are now really hands-on solving problems. Do you think it's a critical thing to have the diversity of thoughts, minds, approaches, life experiences when it comes to attacking these problems?
It's very important, but I don't know how you program it. And so that's that's the challenge. I think, one thing that I would say, I do a lot of treatability study work. And one of the things that I looked for when I was a professor at Georgia Tech in environmental geotechnics, launching that program there back in 1996, and what I look for today, fundamentally, in a good working partner and somebody who I think shows a spark, is curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if they're killing curiosity these days, right?
Yeah.
And so it takes a very unique personality to be able to do sort of treatability study work. This is not fire and forget stuff. You have to sit there and go, I'm making a simulation in the lab that these guys are going to, execute in the field with yellow iron, and chemicals are going to be involved and safety is going to be involved. And I need to think that through for the team, because the project manager and the construction manager are going to roll this out for a big petrochemical client or a mining company. And the first thing you want to do in environmental engineering is no harm.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots of different ways there can be misunderstanding, right, along the way, changes in the equipment process and the remedial scheme and the construction scheme, the sequencing, which can undo, right, your treatability, right, solution, which is heavily focused on chemistry and certain conditions in the field that you have to anticipate. And so the person that does treatability study has to have that long-range vision. And I think fundamentally people who are creative, whatever their disposition is, have the ability to see the end before they begin. How do we find those people? And how do we ensure that they're interdisciplinary and keep their eyes wide open as they're, looking from country to country or challenge to challenge? That's what I look for in good teaming partners. And that can be hard to find when everything's sort of, cookie cutter in some respects. And so, when I'm screening people to work with them, that's sort of what's going on, in the side conversation in my head about, is this person a good candidate for this kind of work? Are they asking lots of questions? Are they curious? Do they want to understand what nature is telling them? And are they paying attention? I can't, for instance, as a technology fellow in Jacobs, I can't always be in the lab. I have to rely on my partners in the lab as my eyes and ears to tell me what's going on and go, hey, we're seeing something here we don't think is supposed to be happening. Is this supposed to be happening? And so, I tend to work with people who are detail-oriented that way, much more so than I am, right? Because I'm more blue sky and, the big ideas and the creative solution as opposed to the brass tacks. But I have to be married to somebody like that in my work or we're not going to get it done. And so there's a place for everybody here, but I think it's going to be the people who are interdisciplinary and very creative and are, to a certain extent, unmoored and open to other ways of thinking that are going to be the ones that find the solutions moving forward.
This is fascinating because we are reaching to the same conclusion that this individualistic perspective that the current academic model has, that one person should be good at everything and we expect an engineering graduate to be creative, to be a perfect communicator, to be able to stand in front of people and present to again, these are all good skills, but it is impossible for a person to excel in all of them. So then the secret is in making sure that we can form functional teams.
And that's a lot of what we focus on at Jacobs is, having balance in the team. I am more focused on the problem solving and trying to solve the puzzle, but I need to be surrounded by other talents in order to be able to carry the enterprise forward. I'm fortunate to work with very talented people who think about their client interactions. Again, I said, going back to the emotional intelligence, I sort of envy people who are just so smooth with people and they're really able to build the trust of the clients and guide them and develop personal friendships with them. And I'm like, how do you do that? Right?
You have other skills. You have other skills.
Right.
I mean,
but
they're all important.
That's not my sweet spot. Some people are just sort of very gifted at that. And, that's not me.
The way that you're gifted in something.
But it takes a village.
Yeah, exactly. So, Dennis, I try to be mindful of the time. It's a fascinating conversation. You mentioned the importance of mentorship. That's very true. I mean, for non-traditional, for square pegs, for those that they don't fit into different environments, having a mentor that understands them and supports them is critical. For me, I was in my junior year, I was about to drop out of school, and like very similar experience as yours. I mean, like I found one of my professors, his name is Zandi. He encouraged me to stay, and like he saw my talent, and like he gave me challenging projects and re-engaged me essentially. So I really owe my becoming an engineer and then like continuing on to him, and actually that encounter that I had with him. So if you go back, I want you to think about it more in terms of like practical advice that you can give to non-traditional learners, how they can find those mentors. I mean, like, what are the unique indicators of like, if that is going to be a good mentor, they need to really kind of spend time to interact with that person more. So can you speak to that a little bit more?
The mentors are sitting out there. They're just not raising their hands. I think that's an interesting situation. I think you have to be yourself and the mentor will appear. At Drexel, for instance, there were several faculty that were in sort of the geo-environmental space. And one of them wasn't able to deal with me at all because I was too all over the place. But as I said, Joe Martin was the right kind of guy who was also sort of very creative and a nonlinear thinker, and he decided to take me under his wing. So I think if you are yourself and you show that you're bright, but, you know, potentially is eccentric, I think the mentor they're going to recognize you and have to make a decision about whether or not they want to work with you. I think there are a lot of other people who look at the personalities and do the personalities mesh, and maybe that's not the case. I wouldn't, with Ed, Joe, and Nick, I wouldn't be where I am. I'm very, very thankful for their taking me on.
Mm-hmm.
I feel sort of that I have this civic responsibility to clean up sites and stuff like that. And I think that comes from the travel. One thing that I did realize at Stanford, and this is, again, being aware, you know, and the only thing I can sort of advocate to the younger generation is be aware. Take notice of what's happening around you.
Okay.
When you grow up traveling around the world, there's a couple things you notice. One is food, languages, culture, differences in architecture. So, of course, I love the architecture, and that's probably what gravitated me towards wanting to be an architect. Mm-hmm. I love to eat. And the other thing that you see, and this is what finally helped me understand what my journey was all about, was the other thing you see is ecological destruction. And when I had that epiphany at Stanford, I realized this is where I'm going to be professionally. I just need to find out where in, right, environmental remediation and environmental sciences. And I'm a pragmatist. I'm not, you know, an idealist that way. You know, what can I do to help? And that gives a lot of meaning to my life. So make sure you're creative. Make sure you are doing what you love. You're going to be working for most of your life. So you better find that what you're happy with and find a way to accentuate your strengths, however unconventional they may be. And here I am, 59. I'm at the end of my career. I got where I wanted to be accomplishment-wise. And so just stick with it.
Dennis, it is amazing to see, despite all adversities, you were able to align your mission, passion, and talent and get where you are now. And your contribution is exceptionally valuable. I mean, it's not only the consulting work, the academic contribution through publications and supporting the scientific society. It's been a true honor for me to get to know you and talk to you. And I think this conversation is full of inspiration.
I wish everybody the best in terms of, you know, finding their way. You know, my mom says life is a journey, and I used to think that was BS, but there isn't a substitute. Find what you love, find somebody that you love, and go do it.
Awesome. It's so good to have people like you in the world.
What else are you going to do?
It gives it meaning.
right?
Thank you so much for your time. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. I
been an
really
honor.
enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to SquarePegs. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Our podcast aims to raise awareness around neurodiversity, advocating for inclusive educational methods, and enhancing belonging for all students. We would love to hear your feedback. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share your biggest takeaways from this episode. Your reviews and feedback helps us improve. You can also leave us a message at squarepegspodcast.com, and we might feature it on the show. Thank you for being a part of the SquarePegs community.